The killer ate ice cream. Not before the murders. Not during. After. For people dead in the rooms below, and he sat in the family computer, logged onto the internet, and ate their food. He used their toilet and didn't flush. He left blood-soaked tissues in a neat pile. He tried on the father's clothing. And then, somewhere around 10 a.m. the next morning, when the winter sun was already high over Tokyo, he climbed out a second-floor window and disappeared into a city of 13 million people. This is the Setagaya case. And here's what keeps Japanese investigators awake at night. They have his DNA. They have his fingerprints. They have the specific sand from his shoes, traced to a U.S. military base. They have the brand of his jacket, the sweatshirt he left behind, even his blood type. They have everything. Except him. December 31st, 2000. 10:50 a.m. Setagaya, Tokyo. The grandmother knew something was wrong when nobody answered the phone. Mikio Miyazawa, 44, was supposed to bring his family to her house for New Year's preparations. His wife Yasuko, 41. Their daughter Nina, 8. Their son Ray, 6. The Miyazawas lived in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. Their two-story house sat at the end of a narrow lane, backed against Miyazawa Park, a small public green space that would become crucial to understanding how the killer entered and exited. When Mikio's mother and Yasuko's sister arrived at the house that morning, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, the lights were still on. Upstairs, in the second-floor loft that Mikio used as a home office, they found him first. Then Yasuko. Then, in a small bedroom on the second floor, both children. All four had been stabbed. The attack had happened sometime the previous night, around 11:30 p.m. Investigators would later determine. But here's where this case splits from every other home invasion you've heard about. The killer didn't run. American cops will tell you, violent criminals flee crime scenes. It's instinct. Even experienced killers know the clock is ticking from the moment they act. But this wasn't America, and this killer didn't follow any script law enforcement had seen before. Tokyo Metropolitan Police arrived within 30 minutes of the grandmother's call. What they found inside the Miyazawa house wasn't just a crime scene. It was an archaeological record of the killer's movements over nearly 10 hours. He'd stayed in the house until mid-morning, moving freely between rooms, leaving a trail of evidence so extensive that investigators initially thought it was planted as misdirection. In the ground-floor bathroom, multiple blood-stained towels. The killer had washed his hands, cleaned his wounds, he'd cut himself during the attack, and treated them with medical supplies from the family's cabinet. Upstairs, he'd logged onto the family computer using their dial-up internet connection. Investigators would later recover the browsing history. He'd visited websites about theater performances and checked a few random pages, seemingly with no purpose. In the kitchen, empty ice cream cups, multiple varieties. The killer had opened the Miyazawa's freezer and helped himself, eating at their table while the family lay dead one floor above. And the clothing. In Mikio's bedroom, investigators found the killer had gone through the father's wardrobe. He tried on several pieces, leaving some items scattered on the floor. His own jacket, a distinctive Korean-made Air Force windbreaker, was left behind in a first-floor closet. So was a hip bag containing sand traced to Edwards Air Force Base in California. Here's what makes this evidence dump so maddening. In Japan, forensic investigation is meticulous to a degree that makes American CSI teams look casual. Tokyo police documented over 1,200 pieces of physical evidence from that house. They ran DNA analysis, this was 2000, remember, when genetic databases were still relatively new, and got a full profile. Mixed European and Asian ancestry. Male. Type A blood. They lifted clear fingerprints from multiple surfaces. In the US, this would be a solved case within months. Run the DNA through Cody's cross-reference military records. Match the prints. But Japan's criminal justice system operates on different principles. No national DNA database. Privacy laws that restrict genetic testing. And a confession-based prosecution culture that makes circumstantial cases, even ones with overwhelming physical evidence, difficult to bring to trial. The killer had left them a map to his identity. But the map was written in a language Japanese law couldn't fully read. By the time investigators processed the scene, a crucial 24 hours had passed. The killer had a full day's head start. And in a city like Tokyo, with its subway systems, its crowds, its thousands of transit points, a day might as well be forever. But that's not the strangest part. The strangest part is what the killer did between 11:30 p.m., when the murders ended, and 10 a.m., when he finally left. Because those 10 hours tell a story that doesn't fit any profile law enforcement had encountered. This wasn't a panicked amateur covering tracks. This wasn't a professional executing a plan. This was something else entirely. And it's that something else that's kept this case unsolved for more than 2 decades. Chapter 2. The Perfect Ordinary Life. Mikio Miyazawa was the kind of man who planned for everything except the one thing that mattered. On the afternoon of December 30th, 2000, his last day alive, he picked up his children from their after-school activities, stopped by the grocery store for New Year's ingredients, and came home to a house that was about to be demolished. Not immediately, but soon. The Miyazawa property sat on land slated for park expansion, and the family had already agreed to move. They'd bought a new house nearby. The deal was done. In 2 months, this chapter of their lives would close naturally on their own terms. The killer had different timing in mind. Here's what American audiences need to understand about Setagaya in 2000. This wasn't some crime-ridden urban zone. This was the Tokyo equivalent of an upscale suburb. Tree-lined streets, low crime, families who'd lived there for generations. The Setagaya ward has nearly 1 million residents, but the specific neighborhood where the Miyazawas lived felt small, intimate. Everyone knew everyone. The park behind their house was where local kids played, where elderly residents took morning walks. In the US, we'd call it a safe neighborhood. The kind of place where people say, "Nothing like this ever happens here." And just like in America, that's exactly what people would say the next day. Mikio was an executive at a British subsidiary company, analytical, detail-oriented, the type to keep meticulous records. Yasuko was a homemaker who'd previously worked as a tutor. Nina, their 8-year-old daughter, was in elementary school, already showing her mother's academic discipline. Ray, 6, was the baby, still discovering the world with that fearless energy young kids have. They were, by every measure, unremarkable. And that's what made investigators' first question so difficult to answer. Why them? December 30th, evening timeline, 6:30 p.m. The family returns home. Mikio parks in their small driveway. Neighbors see lights come on in the house. 7 p.m., Yasuko prepares dinner. This detail comes from the kitchen forensics. Dishes in the sink, food partially prepared, evidence of a normal evening meal. 8:30 p.m., Ray, the 6-year-old, is put to bed. His small bedroom on the 2nd floor becomes the geographic center of what's about to unfold. 9 p.m., Mikio goes upstairs to his loft office. He's working on something. Papers are spread across his desk when police find him. Yasuko stays on the 1st floor, possibly reading or preparing for the next day's trip to the grandmother's house. 11:23 p.m., the first sound. We know the approximate time because of something uniquely Japanese. The Miyazawa's neighbors kept precise records when police asked them to recall that night. In America, witnesses often give vague time frames, sometime around midnight, late evening, but Japanese investigative culture emphasizes specificity, and multiple neighbors independently reported hearing a thud or heavy sound from the Miyazawa house between 11:20 and 11:30 p.m. One neighbor, an elderly man living next door, heard what he described as furniture moving followed by silence. He didn't think much of it. Young family, late night, someone probably knocked something over. In Setagaya, you don't call the police because you hear a bump in the night. That thud was likely Mikio Miyazawa's body, hitting the floor of his 2nd-story office. Here's how investigators reconstructed the attack sequence. The killer entered through the bathroom window on the 1st floor. This window faced the park, the dark, empty park where someone could approach unseen. The window wasn't forced. It wasn't locked. Remember, this was a family 2 months away from moving, in a neighborhood where nobody locked anything. He went upstairs first. Why? This is where the reconstruction gets psychological. In the US, home invaders typically neutralize the greatest threat first, adult males. But the layout of the Miyazawa house was unusual. The staircase was narrow, the second floor was essentially a loft, and anyone coming down those stairs would see immediately if someone was on the ground floor. The killer went for high ground first. Tactical thinking. Or maybe just dumb luck. Mikio was at his desk when the attack began. The forensics show he stood up, turned around, tried to defend himself. He was stabbed multiple times. And here's a detail that still haunts the investigation. He didn't scream. Or if he did, no neighbor heard it. The walls in Japanese homes are notoriously thin. You can hear conversations through them. But no one heard a struggle. Yasuko heard something. She came upstairs. The blood evidence shows she reached the top of the stairs before the killer intercepted her. She fought. Her defensive wounds, cuts on her hands, arms, show she tried to protect herself. But she was smaller and the killer had a knife and momentum. Then both children. Ray first in his small bedroom. Nina was found in the same room, suggesting she either woke up or was with her brother when the killer entered. The entire attack took less than 10 minutes. By 11:35 p.m., all four Miyazawas were dead or dying. And then the clock started on the most bizarre part of this case. The aftermath that shouldn't exist. Tokyo Metropolitan Police didn't just have a crime scene. They had a psychological profile written in real-time behavior. The killer's DNA, yes. His fingerprints, yes. But more than that, they had a record of his choices across 10 hours. What he ate, what he wore, where he went in the house, what websites he visited. In the US, we'd call this a gift. American investigators dream of this much evidence. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. Japan doesn't have the legal infrastructure to weaponize it. No DNA database for cross-referencing. No way to compel suspects to give samples without arrest. And the cultural barrier. Japanese courts require overwhelming, airtight cases. Circumstantial evidence alone, even mountains of it, often isn't enough. The killer had left everything except a signed confession. And somewhere in Tokyo or beyond, he was now just another face in the crowd, carrying secrets that 1,200 pieces of evidence couldn't name. But here's what investigators were about to discover. The evidence wasn't random. The sand from Edwards Air Force Base, the Korean jacket, the mixed ancestry DNA. These weren't just clues. They were breadcrumbs leading to a suspect profile that would turn this case international and make it infinitely more complicated. Chapter 3. The evidence that pointed everywhere. The sand told a story. The problem was nobody could agree on which story it was telling. January 2, 2001. 48 hours after the bodies were discovered. Tokyo Metropolitan Police Headquarters. Setagaya Investigation Unit. Lead Detective Tsutomu Sato spread the contents of the killer's hip bag across the examination table. Dark sand. Not Tokyo sand. Tokyo soil is clay-heavy, reddish-brown, sticky. This was different. Fine-grained. Specific mineral composition. The kind of sand that doesn't lie about where it's been. The forensic geology team ran the analysis 3 times to be sure. The sand matched samples from Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. Not similar to, not consistent with, matched, down to the microscopic silica signature. In America, this would trigger immediate FBI involvement, military liaison, international databases. In Japan, it triggered something more complicated, jurisdictional questions that moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Here's the cultural gap American listeners need to understand. Japanese law enforcement operates on a prefecture system. Tokyo Metropolitan Police investigate crimes in Tokyo. They can request cooperation from other agencies, but they can't demand it. And international cooperation, especially involving U.S. military installations, requires diplomatic channels that move in months, not days. The killer had left a geographic fingerprint pointing to California. But the Tokyo police couldn't just fly to Edwards Air Force Base and start interviewing personnel. They had to file requests, wait for approvals, navigate treaties. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. The hip bag contained more than sand. Inside, a small cloth pouch, the kind used for accessories. Nothing else. No ID, no wallet, no keys. The bag itself was unremarkable, generic design, sold throughout Asia. But that sand was a beacon screaming one thing: American military connection. Then there was the jacket. The killer had left behind a distinctive windbreaker, dark-colored, with specific stitching patterns. The label identified it as manufactured by a Korean company called Ramapo. Here's where it gets interesting. This particular model was sold primarily on U.S. military bases in South Korea and Japan, not in regular stores. Not online. This was 2000, remember, before everything was available everywhere. You got this jacket one way, you had access to military base exchanges. Two pieces of evidence, both pointing to the same conclusion. Someone with ties to U.S. military installations. Detective Satu's team started building the profile. Male, 15 to 35 years old, based on the clothing sizes and physical evidence. Mixed ancestry. DNA showed markers consistent with European and Asian heritage. Type A blood from samples at the scene. Height approximately 170 to 175 centimeters. About 5 foot 7 inch -5'9" in American measurements, based on shoe size and reach patterns during the attack. Possible military connection. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Left-handed. Forensic analysis of knife wounds suggested a left-handed attacker. In the U.S., this profile would go into every database we have. CODIS for DNA. AFIS for fingerprints. Military personnel records. Immigration files. We'd be cross-referencing, narrowing, hunting. Japan had the data but not the legal framework to use it aggressively. January 10, 2001. The investigation unit received their first major tip. A woman called the hotline. She'd seen the news coverage. By now, every network in Japan was running the story, and something clicked. A young man, mixed heritage, who'd been acting strangely. She wouldn't give her name, but she gave a description and a neighborhood. Detectives followed up. They found a possible match. A man in his early 20s, half American, living in Tokyo. He'd recently left Japan. His apartment was empty. Neighbors said he'd moved out suddenly, right after New Year's. The timing was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. But here's the problem. Without an arrest warrant, Japanese police couldn't compel DNA samples from relatives. They couldn't search property without evidence of ongoing criminal activity. And the man was now outside Japan's jurisdiction, likely back in the United States. The lead went cold. Not because investigators didn't want to pursue it, because the legal system didn't give them the tools to pursue it aggressively. This is where American viewers need to understand something fundamental about Japanese criminal justice. It's built on confessions, not forensics. The conviction rate in Japan is over 99%, but that's because prosecutors only bring cases they're absolutely certain they can win. And certain means confession or eyewitness testimony. Physical evidence alone, even DNA, even fingerprints, is considered insufficient without corroborating testimony. The Tokyo police had the killer's genetic code. They just couldn't do much with it. February 2001. The investigation expanded to include Interpol and U.S. military cooperation. Detectives traveled to Korea, investigating the jacket's distribution chain. They contacted Edwards Air Force Base in California, requesting personnel records and visitor logs from 1998 to 2000. The U.S. military cooperated to a point. Privacy regulations limited what they could share. Base access records from 3 years prior weren't comprehensive. And the sand? Thousands of people had walked through Edwards Air Force Base during that time frame. Military personnel, contractors, visitors, family members. The evidence was specific enough to point to a needle. But the haystack was an entire military-industrial complex spanning the Pacific. March 2001. 3 months after the murders, the investigation unit had processed 1,200 pieces of physical evidence, interviewed over 12,000 people, and received thousands of tips from the public. They'd created the most detailed forensic profile in Japanese criminal history, and they had 0 arrests. Detective Satu stood in the Miyazawa house, still a sealed crime scene, now empty and quiet. He walked through the killer's route. Bathroom window, up the stairs, the loft where Mikio died, down to Ray's bedroom, back to the kitchen where the ice cream was eaten. 10 hours. The killer had spent 10 hours here, leaving a breadcrumb trail that led everywhere and nowhere. But there was one piece of evidence they hadn't fully explored yet. One detail that would change the entire trajectory of the investigation and open up a possibility no one had seriously considered. The computer, and what the killer had been searching for during those dark hours while the family lay dead around him. Chapter 4: The Browser History of a Murderer. The killer Googled Drakengard. Not escape routes. Not how to clean blood. Not police scanner frequencies or airline schedules. He sat at Mikio Miyazawa's computer, blood still on his hands, and searched for information about a Japanese video game that wouldn't be released for another 3 years. This is the detail that broke every profile the Tokyo Metropolitan Police had built. January 15, 2001. The digital forensics team finished analyzing the Miyazawa family computer. In 2000, this was cutting-edge investigation. Most Japanese households had only recently gotten internet access, and the idea of browser history as evidence was still relatively new. The family used a dial-up connection through a local ISP. Every website visit, every search query, every click was logged with timestamps. The killer had been online from approximately 1:15 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. on December 31st. Over an hour of activity. And what investigators found wasn't what anyone expected. He visited theater websites, performance schedules for drama productions in the Tokyo area. He browsed a site about a local theater company's upcoming shows. Then the video game searches, queries about fantasy games, release dates, character information. He checked a few random informational sites. No pattern. No obvious purpose. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case, sat in the investigation room reading the printout. He'd worked dozens of homicides, interviewed countless violent offenders. He looked up at Detective Sato and said something that would redirect the entire investigation. This isn't a killer trying to cover tracks. This is someone killing time. Let that sink in. Killing time. After murdering 4 people, the perpetrator was bored, restless, passing hours the way any insomniac might, clicking through random internet pages with no clear goal. In America, we have extensive research on post-crime behavior. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has documented patterns. Panicked flight, evidence destruction, returning to normal routines. But this was unprecedented. This suggested someone either profoundly detached from what they'd done, or someone so comfortable with violence that 4 deaths didn't register as worth urgency. Dr. Yamamoto proposed 3 possibilities. Theory 1. Psychopathy. Classic antisocial personality disorder. The killer felt no emotional connection to the victims, experienced no fear or remorse, and therefore had no psychological need to flee. The murders were functional, achieving some goal, and afterward there was simply nothing urgent to do. Theory 2. Dissociation. Severe psychological break. The killer had committed the murders in one mental state, then woke up in another, with no emotional connection to what had just happened. The casual internet browsing wasn't callousness. It was confusion, someone trying to ground themselves in normalcy. Theory 3. Waiting. The killer was waiting for something specific. A time, a signal, a planned pickup. The internet activity was genuine boredom while waiting for a predetermined extraction window. Each theory pointed to a different suspect profile. Each required different investigative approaches. And the evidence supported all 3 equally. But here's what the computer revealed that changed everything. The IP address showed the killer had also attempted to access his own email. The login failed, wrong password or wrong username or both. But the attempt was logged. And the email domain was tracked. It was a US-based free email service. Common in America, less common in Japan at the time. The digital forensics team tried to trace the account. They contacted the service provider, went through international request channels. But free email services in 2000 didn't keep extensive records. User data was minimal. Without the actual login credentials, there was no way to identify who owned the account. Another breadcrumb. Another dead end. February 20th, 2001. A breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A man walked into a Koban, a small neighborhood police box, in Kanagawa Prefecture, just south of Tokyo. He was agitated, sweating despite the winter cold. He told the officers he needed to confess to something: the Setagaya murders. Within an hour, he was at Tokyo Metropolitan Police headquarters. Detective Sato and 3 others sat across from him in an interview room. The man was Japanese, early 30s, disheveled. He said he'd been having dreams about the murders. Vivid dreams. He was convinced he'd committed them while in some kind of fugue state. They asked him to describe the house layout. He got it wrong. They asked him details about the victims. Wrong again. They asked him what he'd eaten. He said he couldn't remember eating anything. The investigators took his DNA anyway. Standard procedure. It didn't match. This was the first of 11 false confessions the investigation would receive over the next 6 months. 11 people, all convinced or claiming they were the killer. None matching the evidence. In Japan, false confessions are a known issue. The cultural shame around unsolved crimes can drive people to confess to restore social order, even when they're innocent. In America, we see false confessions too, but usually from suspects under interrogation pressure. In Japan, people walk in voluntarily. Each false confession wasted resources. Each one required full investigation. And each one reminded the real investigation team of the central paradox. They had evidence that could prove innocence in minutes. But without a legitimate suspect to test against, it was useless. March 2001. The case was now international news. CNN, BBC, major American networks, all covering the Tokyo family murders with the mysterious evidence. The story had everything: suburban safety shattered, bizarre killer behavior, international military connections, unsolved despite overwhelming forensics. The Japanese public was transfixed and terrified. If this could happen in Setagaya, safe, quiet Setagaya, it could happen anywhere. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police faced pressure from every direction. The media wanted answers. The public wanted arrests. The Miyazawa family survivors wanted justice. And the investigators had a browser history, sand from California, and a jacket from Korea. But they didn't have the one thing that Japanese criminal justice requires above all else: a suspect who would confess. Detective Sato returned to the computer evidence one more time. He read through the website logs, looking for anything they'd missed. Theater websites, video games, random searches. And then he saw it, buried in the timestamps. A pattern in the clicking, not in what was searched, but in the rhythm of the searches. Long pauses between some clicks. Rapid sequences between others. Like someone hesitant. Someone unfamiliar with the keyboard layout. Or someone whose hands were injured and having trouble typing. The killer had cut himself during the attack. They knew this from the blood evidence. But what if the cuts were worse than they'd assumed? What if the slow, meandering internet activity wasn't about psychology at all? It was about pain, about bandaged fingers struggling with a keyboard. This wasn't a casual browser. This was someone physically impaired, waiting for his hands to stop bleeding long enough to climb out a window. And if that was true, if the killer had serious hand injuries from the attack, then he would have needed medical treatment. Soon, within days, somewhere in Tokyo or beyond, a young man with mixed heritage and fresh hand wounds had visited a doctor or hospital in the first week of January 2001. Now they just had to find which one. Chapter 5: The Hospital Ghost. In America, this would take 48 hours. In Japan, it took 3 months. March 2001. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police launched Operation Kizaguchi. Wound opening. The mission: identify every medical facility visit in Tokyo and surrounding prefectures between December 31st, 2000 and January 10th, 2001 involving a male patient aged 15 to 35 with hand lacerations. In the U.S., this would be a HIPAA request with a warrant. Centralized medical records, digital databases, federal authority compelling cooperation. American investigators could pull these records in days, cross-reference insurance claims, track pharmacy prescriptions for antibiotics or pain medication. Japan had no such system. Medical records were private, decentralized, paper-based. Each hospital, each clinic, each small neighborhood doctor's office kept independent records. And privacy laws, even stricter than America's HIPAA, meant police needed specific probable cause for each individual request. They had to ask, and wait, and hope. Detective Satou's team sent requests to 1,247 medical facilities across the greater Tokyo area. Hospitals, urgent care clinics, private practices. The request was specific. Male patients treated for hand wounds, particularly deep cuts consistent with knife injuries, during the first 10 days of January 2001. By April, they'd received 823 responses. Most said no matching patients. Some ignored the request entirely. 17 facilities reported possible matches. Investigators followed up on all 17. They interviewed doctors, reviewed intake logs, collected names. 4 patients agreed to voluntary DNA testing to clear themselves. All 4 were excluded. 6 patients had moved or couldn't be located. 7 were confirmed to have had injuries from documented accidents, workplace incidents, kitchen mishaps, broken glass. Every lead turned to smoke. But there was a problem with Operation Kizaguchi that Dr. Yamamoto, the criminal psychologist, raised in a team meeting in late April. What if he didn't seek treatment in Japan? The room went quiet. The U.S. military connection. The jacket from base exchanges. The sand from California. What if the killer wasn't a resident? What if he'd come to Japan specifically for this purpose, or had left immediately after? If he'd flown out within 24 to 48 hours, his hand injuries could have been treated anywhere. Korean military hospitals. U.S. base medical facilities. Private clinics in America. The search zone wasn't Tokyo, it was the entire Pacific Rim. May 2001. 5 months after the murders. The investigation officially went international. Tokyo Metropolitan Police worked with Interpol to issue information requests to military medical facilities in South Korea and on U.S. bases in Japan. They flagged immigration records, looking for departures of mixed heritage males between December 31st and January 5th. The responses came back slowly. U.S. military cooperation was limited by regulations. They couldn't release medical records without patient consent or probable cause that met American legal standards. South Korean authorities had their own bureaucratic timelines. And the immigration records revealed something that made the investigation exponentially harder. In the week between New Year's and January 7th, over 14,000 foreign nationals departed Japan through Tokyo's 2 international airports. Students returning home after holidays. Business travelers. Military personnel on rotation. Tourists. 14,000 possible suspects. All beyond Japanese jurisdiction. But the investigation team caught one break, small but significant. The DNA profile. Remember, mixed European and Asian ancestry. When the lab results first came back, they'd noted something unusual about the genetic markers. The Asian component wasn't typical Japanese. The markers suggested Southeast Asian heritage, potentially Korean, possibly Filipino, or Southern Chinese. This narrowed the profile. Not just any mixed heritage male. Someone with one European parent, likely American or British, and one parent from Korea, the Philippines, or Southern China. In U.S. military demographics, this was a common combination. American service members stationed in Korea or the Philippines often married local women. The children of these marriages, military dependents, grew up with base access military IDs, the ability to shop at exchanges where Korean-made jackets were sold. The profile was getting clearer, but it was also getting more depressing. Because here's what it meant. The suspect was likely someone who could move freely between countries, someone with military connections that made them difficult to track, someone who'd left no digital footprint in Japanese society because they'd never really been part of it. They were hunting a ghost who'd walked through Tokyo, murdered for people, and walked back out. June 2001. 6 months after the murders. The Miyazawa house was still sealed as a crime scene, but the family's relatives petitioned to have it released. They wanted to demolish it, honor the original plan to convert the land to park space, remove the physical reminder of that night. Tokyo Metropolitan Police requested 6 more months. The case was still active. They might need to return to the scene. The petition was denied. The house stood empty, a monument to unsolved questions. Detective Satou visited it one more time in mid-June. He stood in the kitchen where the killer had eaten ice cream. He looked at the computer where the browsing had happened. He walked up the narrow stairs and stood in the loft where Mikio Miyazawa had died. And he noticed something they'd catalogued but never emphasized. The view from the second-floor windows. You could see the park. The entire park. From up here, on a winter night with bare trees, you'd have a clear sight line across the green space to the surrounding streets. The killer had stayed 10 hours. But what if he wasn't just waiting randomly? What if he was watching? Watching for police. Watching for patterns of patrol. Waiting until the neighborhood fully settled into New Year's morning routine, when everyone would be home, preoccupied with family, not looking at strangers walking down the street. It wasn't dissociation or boredom. It was surveillance. He'd turned the crime scene into an observation post, waiting for the optimal escape window. That suggested planning, patience, tactical thinking, and it suggested something else. The killer knew Japanese neighborhood patterns. He understood that New Year's morning would be the one time when a stranger walking through Setagaya wouldn't draw attention, because everyone would be inside with family. He hadn't just stumbled into this crime. He'd timed it. But why the Miyazawas? That was still the unanswerable question. Random home invasion? Targeted hit? Personal vendetta? The evidence supported all three theories equally. And without a suspect to interrogate, without a confession, the motive remained a black box. July 2001. 7 months in. The investigation was still officially active, but the daily team had been reduced. Other cases demanded resources. The public's attention had moved on. The news cycles had found new horrors to cover. Detective Satu remained lead investigator, but now it was him and 3 others, down from the 20 who'd worked the case in January. And then the phone rang. American FBI Pacific Field Office. They had something. Possible lead. A military-dependent, half-Korean, early 20s, had been flagged in a routine background check. He'd returned to the U.S. from Japan on January 3, 2001, 3 days after the murders. His re-entry interview at LAX noted visible hand injuries. He'd told Customs they were from a skateboarding accident. The FBI had his name, his address, his military family connections. They had everything except jurisdiction to compel a DNA sample. And without probable cause that met U.S. legal standards, without evidence that would convince an American judge, they couldn't get a warrant. They needed Japan to formally request extradition, or they needed the suspect to voluntarily cooperate. Tokyo Metropolitan Police prepared the request. They compiled their evidence, translated everything into English, submitted it through official diplomatic channels. And they waited, because here's what Americans don't understand about international criminal justice. It moves at the speed of diplomacy. Treaties, protocols, mutual assistance agreements. Weeks become months. Months become years. The suspect in California knew he was being looked at. He had a lawyer, and he had rights under U.S. law that Japanese evidence alone couldn't override. The case that should have been solved in weeks was entering its first year. With no arrest, no trial, no justice, but the evidence was still there. The DNA, the fingerprints, waiting. And in California, a young man was living his life, wondering if the knock on his door would ever come. Chapter 6. The Man Who Wasn't There. His name was Kevin Marks. Half Korean, half American. 23 years old. Military dependent who'd lived on Yokoto Air Base outside Tokyo for 2 years before returning to California on January 3, 2001. And he was completely innocent. August 2001. The FBI's Pacific Field Office completed their investigation of Kevin Marks. Voluntary interview. Voluntary DNA sample. Full cooperation. The DNA didn't match. Not even close. The hand injuries? Exactly what he'd said. Skateboarding accident on December 28, witnessed by 3 friends, treated at the base clinic with full documentation. Detective Satu got the news via fax on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice. Then he walked out of Tokyo Metropolitan Police headquarters and stood in the summer heat, watching traffic move through the intersection. 8 months. 8 months following a lead that looked perfect on paper and meant nothing in reality. This is the part of investigations that TV crime shows never show you. The leads that consume resources, demand attention, and end with a quiet fax saying, "Not your guy." In America, we'd move on immediately. Next lead, next theory, keep pushing. But Japanese investigative culture operates differently. Each failed lead requires review, documentation, lessons learned analysis. The Kevin Marks investigation had involved FBI cooperation, diplomatic requests, international coordination. Couldn't just be dismissed, it had to be processed. While Tokyo police were processing, the killer was still out there, living his life. Maybe in America, maybe in Korea, maybe back in Japan, walking past Koban police boxes every day. September 2001. The world changed, and with it, so did investigative priorities. The September 11th attacks in New York shifted global law enforcement focus. American resources that had been available for international cooperation suddenly redirected to counterterrorism. The FBI's Pacific Field Office, which had been working the Setagaya case as a favor to Japanese authorities, now had agents deployed to urgent national security matters. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police understood. But understanding didn't solve the case. By October, the daily investigation team was down to Detective Sato and one other investigator. They continued following tips, the hotline still received calls, still generated leads, but the momentum had died. Media coverage had moved on. Public attention had shifted. The Miyazawa family relatives finally got permission to demolish the house. By November 2001, it was gone. The land was absorbed into the park expansion, where 4 people had died. Children now played on new playground equipment. Only a small memorial stone marked the location. Most people walking through the park didn't notice it, but the evidence remained. Tokyo Metropolitan Police maintained the case file, the DNA profile, the 1,200 cataloged items. They uploaded the DNA to every international database that would accept it. They kept the fingerprints in active search status. They continued to monitor the tip line. And slowly, a new theory began to emerge, one that explained why every lead had failed, why the evidence pointed everywhere and nowhere. January 2002. 1 year after the murders, Dr. Yamamoto returned to consult on the case. He'd spent the intervening months researching similar cases internationally, unsolved home invasions with excessive evidence left behind. He found 3 cases. 1 in Australia, 1997. 1 in Canada, 1999. 1 in Germany, 2000. All involved family murders, extended time at the crime scene, bizarre post-crime behavior, and suspects who vanished despite significant evidence. None were solved, but they shared a pattern. The killers weren't professional criminals. They weren't career murderers. They were what criminologists call one-time actors. People who commit a single catastrophic crime and then return to normal life, never offending again. Here's what makes them impossible to catch, Dr. Yamamoto told Detective Sato. They're not in the system. No prior arrests, no DNA on file, no reason for law enforcement to ever collect their information. They commit one crime, terrible, violent, but isolated, and then stop. They don't get caught because they never give us a reason to look at them twice. In the US, we have genetic genealogy now. In 2001, that technology didn't exist. You couldn't take crime scene DNA and build a family tree through public genealogy databases. You needed a direct match or you had nothing. The Setagaya killer's DNA was pristine, complete, perfectly preserved. But without a comparison sample, it was just letters on a page. March 2002. A break, real this time. A woman in Saitama Prefecture, just north of Tokyo, contacted police. She'd been cleaning out her deceased brother's apartment and found something disturbing. A collection of news clippings about the Miyazawa murders. Detailed notes. Maps of the Setagaya neighborhood. Her brother had died in February from a heart attack. He was 34. Mixed heritage, Japanese mother, American service member father. He'd lived alone, worked as a night shift warehouse supervisor, kept to himself. The timing was possible. The profile fit. The obsession with the case suggested guilty knowledge. Tokyo Metropolitan Police obtained permission to exhume the body. They collected DNA samples, sent them to the lab with priority flags. The results came back in 2 weeks. Not a match. The brother had been following the case. Maybe obsessively, maybe disturbingly, but he wasn't the killer. Just another person consumed by the mystery of the unsolvable crime. By mid-2002, Detective Sato had a new ritual. Once a month, he'd visit the park where the Miyazawa house had stood. He'd sit on a bench and watch the families playing, the children running through the grass where a bathroom window had once looked out onto darkness. He'd review the evidence in his mind. The sand, the jacket, the DNA, the 10 hours, the ice cream, the browsing history, and he'd ask himself the question that no investigation had answered. Why them? Random selection? The house was isolated, at the end of a lane, backed against the park. Easy access, but so were 50 other houses in that neighborhood. Why specifically the Miyazawas? Personal vendetta? Mikio had worked for a British company, had business contacts, traveled occasionally. But investigators had combed through his life for months and found nothing. No conflicts, no enemies, no shady deals. He was boring in the way that most victims of random violence are boring. Just a person living a normal life until someone decided otherwise. Targeted hit? The military connection suggested possible organized crime, but the execution didn't match. Professional killers don't stay at crime scenes eating ice cream. They don't leave DNA everywhere. They don't browse the internet for video game information. Every theory had a fatal flaw. Every explanation missed something critical. Unless there was a fourth option no one had seriously considered. What if the Miyazawas weren't the target? What if the killer had intended to hit a different house? And in the darkness, the narrow lanes of Setagaya, the unfamiliar neighborhood layout, what if he'd simply gone to the wrong address? Sounds absurd. But Detective Sato started checking. Were there any other families in the area with similar names? Similar house layouts? Anyone with potential enemies, potential reasons to be targeted? He found two possibilities. Both within 4 blocks of the Miyazawa house. Both with adult males in their 40s, similar family structures. One had a husband involved in debt collection, a profession that makes enemies. The other had recently testified in a civil lawsuit that cost a construction company millions of yen. Either could have been a target. Either could have motivated someone to hire violence. But proving it? Connecting a possible motive to the evidence they had? That required the one thing they still didn't have. A suspect to connect the dots. The case entered its 3rd year. Then its 4th. The anniversary media coverage became routine. Every December 30th, a few articles remembering the unsolved murders. Every year, fewer details. Less attention. The Miyazawa family survivors stopped giving interviews. They wanted to move on, to remember their loved ones as people, not as victims in an eternal unsolved mystery. Detective Sato retired in 2008. The case file passed to a new lead investigator. Then another. Then another. Each one reviewed the evidence, followed new leads as they emerged, and hit the same walls. But the DNA remained. The fingerprints remained. And in Tokyo Metropolitan Police headquarters, in a climate-controlled evidence room, 1,200 items from that night waited. Because here's the thing about modern forensics. It doesn't have a statute of limitations. DNA doesn't expire, and technology keeps improving. What couldn't be analyzed in 2000 became possible in 2010. What couldn't be matched in 2010 became possible in 2020. The case isn't closed. It's waiting. Waiting for the one piece that makes everything else make sense. Waiting for the killer to make a mistake. Chapter 7. The DNA that won't forget. December 30th, 2020. 20 years after the murders. Tokyo Metropolitan Police held a press conference that lasted 11 minutes and said almost nothing new. The case remains unsolved. The investigation remains active. The evidence remains preserved. Anyone with information should contact the dedicated hotline. What they didn't say, what couldn't be said in an official capacity, was that the case had become something else entirely. Not a criminal investigation anymore. A technological waiting game. Here's what changed between 2001 and 2020. DNA science exploded. In 2001, genetic analysis could tell you basic ancestry markers, blood type, gender. By 2020, consumer DNA databases contained profiles of over 30 million people. Genetic genealogy services could take an unknown DNA sample and build a family tree going back generations. This was the technology that caught the Golden State Killer in California, a case unsolved for 40 years until a familial DNA search through public databases identified a suspect. American law enforcement uses these tools routinely now. Upload crime scene DNA to GED-Match or Family Tree DNA. Find distant cousins. Work backward through genealogy records until you narrow the suspect pool to one person. Japan can't do this. Japanese law prohibits uploading DNA profiles from criminal investigations to commercial databases. Privacy regulations prevent the kind of broad genetic phishing that solved cases in America. The cultural framework is different. Collective privacy rights outweigh individual crime-solving in the legal hierarchy. So the Setagaya DNA sits in a police database, pristine and useless, while in America the same sample could potentially name the killer in months. This is the frustration that current investigators live with. They have 21st century evidence trapped in a 20th century legal framework. But in 2019, something shifted. Tokyo Metropolitan Police quietly approached the FBI with a proposal. A joint task force using American genetic genealogy resources, with Japanese oversight, to analyze the Setagaya DNA through U.S. databases. The request was unprecedented. Japanese authorities asking America to use investigative techniques that Japan's own laws prohibit. The FBI agreed to a limited pilot program. The Setagaya DNA profile was uploaded to a law enforcement genetic genealogy database in the U.S. The search ran through millions of profiles looking for familial matches, second cousins, third cousins, any genetic connection that could start building a family tree. The results came back in March 2020. 17 possible familial matches. Distant relations, all in the United States. The closest was a third cousin relationship, enough to start genealogy research, but a massive undertaking requiring hundreds of hours tracing family lineage. The FBI assigned 2 genealogy specialists to the case. They began building family trees from the 17 matches, looking for common ancestors, trying to narrow the suspect pool. And then COVID-19 shut the world down. The genealogy work stopped. Resources redirected. The momentum died again. By 2021, the work resumed, but slower. One of the 17 matches had been eliminated, wrong lineage branch. 3 others led to dead ends, family trees that couldn't be traced far enough back. That left 13 active lines of investigation. But here's the problem with genetic genealogy. It's labor-intensive detective work, not magic. Each potential match requires reconstructing entire family histories, tracking immigration records, marriage certificates, birth records across multiple countries. For families with Korean-American heritage and trans-Pacific movements, the records are often incomplete or non-existent. By late 2023, the FBI team had narrowed 13 matches to 7 possible family lines that fit the profile. American military connections, East Asian ancestry, presence in Japan during the late 1990s. 7 families, potentially hundreds of individual males in the right age range. And no legal mechanism to compel DNA samples from any of them without probable cause that meets U.S. constitutional standards. Current lead investigator, Detective Hiroshi Nakamura, inherited the case in 2018. He's the 6th person to hold this position. He told a Japanese news outlet in December 2024, "We know more about the killer's genetics than we know about most people. We just don't know his name." The theories have evolved over 20 years. Theory 1, wrong house. The killer intended to target someone else in the neighborhood. The Miyazawas were tragic collateral damage. This explains the randomness, the lack of clear motive. Probability, 30%. Theory 2, military connection gone wrong. The killer had some connection to Mikio's work, possibly through his British company's dealings with U.S. military contracts. A dispute, a debt, something that triggered targeted violence. The 10-hour stay was waiting for extraction or further instructions that never came. Probability, 25%. Theory 3, random predator. The killer was a violent individual who selected the house based purely on opportunity. Isolated location, easy access from the park. No personal connection, no deeper motive. The evidence he left behind reflects disorganization and psychological disturbance, not calculation. Probability, 20%. Theory 4, revenge against the wrong person. Someone hired or motivated the killer to attack a specific target, gave bad information, and the wrong family died. The killer realized the mistake mid-attack or afterward, which explains the bizarre post-crime behavior, shock at having murdered the wrong people. Probability, 15%. Theory 5, redacted. Tokyo Metropolitan Police maintains one theory that has never been publicly disclosed. Details remain sealed in the active investigation file. Probability, unknown. What we know for certain in 2026, the killer left behind one of the most complete forensic profiles in criminal history. Height, weight, blood type, mixed European-Asian ancestry, specific geographic connections to U.S. military installations, left-handed, clothing sizes, even the minerals in the soil he'd walked through. He's somewhere. Likely in his mid to late 40s now. Possibly in America. Possibly with a family who has no idea what he did on December 30th, 2000. He may have never committed another crime. He may have lived a normal life for 25 years, carrying one night of violence like a stone in his pocket. Or he may check the news every December 30th, wondering if this is the year they finally connect the dots. The Miyazawa family memorial stone in Setagaya still receives visitors. Fresh flowers appear regularly. The park is beautiful now, full of life and children's laughter. Most people using it have no idea what happened there. But the evidence remembers. In a climate-controlled room in Tokyo Metropolitan Police headquarters, 1,200 items wait. The DNA doesn't degrade. The fingerprints remain clear. And the technology keeps improving. In America, we've solved cases 40, 50 years old using genetic genealogy. The Setagaya murders are only 25 years old. In the timeline of forensic technology, that's nothing. The killer left everything except a name. But DNA is a name written in genetic code. And someone, somewhere in America, shares genes with the man who killed 4 people and stayed to eat their ice cream. The question isn't if he'll be found anymore. The question is when. And whether Japanese and American law can cooperate enough to turn scientific identification into legal justice. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We might identify him before we can prosecute him. Science might solve what law cannot touch. And then what? Chapter 8. The Unsolved Equation. 25 years. 9,131 days since Mikio, Yasuko, Nina, and Rei Miyazawa were murdered in their home. And the case file grows thicker while the list of suspects stays at 0. But here's what makes the Setagaya case different from most cold cases. We're not missing evidence. We're drowning in it. Let's be clear about what's been proven beyond any doubt. The killer's physical profile: male, mixed European and Asian, likely Korean or Southeast Asian, ancestry, type A blood, approximately 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 9 inches, left-handed, age 15 to 35 in the year 2000, making him 40 to 60 years old today. The geographic connections: sand from Edwards Air Force Base in California, a Korean-manufactured jacket sold primarily at U.S. military base exchanges. These aren't circumstantial hints. These are scientific certainties. The timeline: entry through the bathroom window around 11:20 p.m. on December 30th, 2000. Murders completed by 11:35 p.m. The killer remained in the house until approximately 10 a.m. on December 31st. Roughly 10 hours of documented presence through forensic evidence and computer activity logs. The behavior: he ate ice cream. He used the bathroom. He attempted to access his email. He browsed websites about theater and video games. He treated his hand wounds with the family's medical supplies. He tried on Mikio's clothing. And then he climbed out a second-floor window and vanished into Tokyo on New Year's morning. This isn't speculation. This is documented fact, preserved in 1,200 pieces of physical evidence that remain in Tokyo Metropolitan Police custody today. So why hasn't he been caught? 2 reasons, and Americans need to understand both. Reason 1: legal systems aren't designed to talk to each other. Japanese law prohibits the kind of aggressive DNA database searching that American law enforcement uses routinely. Privacy rights, cultural frameworks around genetic information, and a constitutional structure that prioritizes collective privacy over individual prosecution create walls that evidence can't penetrate. The killer's DNA could be sitting in an American consumer genetics database right now, 23andMe, Ancestry, one of dozens of services. But Japanese law enforcement can't access those databases directly. They need American cooperation, which requires FBI resources, which requires prioritization against thousands of other cases. In America, if we had this much evidence, we'd have an arrest. In Japan, having evidence and being able to legally use it are two different things. Reason 2. One-time offenders are ghosts. If the Setagaya killer never committed another crime, never got arrested, never entered the system, never gave authorities a reason to collect his DNA, he's essentially invisible. He could be living a completely normal life. Married, kids, steady job, community involvement. No one around him would have any reason to suspect that 25 years ago, he murdered for people and ate their ice cream. Career criminals get caught eventually. They reoffend, they escalate, they make mistakes. But someone who commits one catastrophic act and then stops, they're the hardest targets in all of criminal investigation. So where does that leave us? 3 theories, ranked by current investigative probability. Theory 1. Military-adjacent targeting, 35% probability. The killer had a connection, direct or indirect, to U.S. military installations in Japan. The Edwards Air Force Base sand, the base exchange jacket, the mixed heritage profile all point here. The motive was specific. Either Mikio was involved in something through his British company's work, or the killer believed he was, or the killer targeted the wrong house entirely but had military-connected reasons for the attack. The 10-hour stay was waiting for extraction or a planned pickup that either never came or got aborted. The bizarre post-crime behavior was shock at a plan going wrong. This theory explains the evidence profile best. It also explains why he's never been caught. If he returned to the U.S. immediately and never offended again, he's protected by jurisdictional barriers and the sheer size of the American military-dependent population. Theory 2. Wrong house, catastrophic error, 30% probability. The killer intended to murder someone else in the Setagaya neighborhood, possibly one of 2 families within 4 blocks who had potential enemies and similar house layouts. In the darkness, in an unfamiliar area, he entered the wrong home. He realized the mistake during or after the attack, which explains the dissociative post-crime behavior. He wasn't casually browsing the internet. He was in psychological shock, unable to process what he'd done, mechanically killing time until his brain could restart enough to plan an escape. This theory explains the lack of clear motive connecting to the Miyazawas. It also explains why the crime was never repeated. It was supposed to be a one-time targeted hit, and after killing the wrong family, the killer, or whoever hired him, had no reason to try again. Theory 3. Psychopathic predator. Random selection, 25% probability. The killer was a violent individual with no connection to the victims. He selected the Miyazawa house based purely on opportunity. Isolated location, easy access from the park, lights on indicating people home. The attack was sexually or psychologically motivated predation. The 10-hour stay reflected profound psychological detachment. He felt no urgency to flee because he felt no emotional connection to what he'd done. The internet browsing was genuine boredom, genuine casualness, because 4 deaths didn't register as traumatic to someone with severe antisocial pathology. This theory explains the evidence left behind. Someone so psychologically detached wouldn't worry about DNA or fingerprints. It also explains why geographic and military connections might be coincidental rather than meaningful. He happened to have walked through Edwards Air Force Base at some point. He happened to own a jacket from a base exchange. Coincidence, not conspiracy. Theory 4. Redacted, 10% probability. Tokyo Metropolitan Police maintains one additional theory that has never been publicly disclosed. Current investigators have stated only that this theory involves international complications and remains under active investigation. Whether this involves specific suspects, diplomatic sensitivities, or classified information related to military or intelligence operations is unknown. Here's what every theory agrees on. The Setagaya murders should be solvable. The evidence is there. The science exists. What's missing is the legal and jurisdictional framework to turn scientific certainty into an arrest. In 2026, genetic genealogy technology continues to improve. The FBI's genealogy work on the 17 familial matches hasn't stopped. It's just slow, methodical, underfunded. Each year brings a few more family trees mapped, a few more branches eliminated, the suspect pool slowly narrowing. Somewhere, the killer is aging. If he's still alive, and statistically a man in his 40s or 50s likely is, he's carrying this secret into middle age. Maybe he's told someone. Maybe he's confessed to a spouse, a friend, a therapist. Maybe that confession will eventually reach law enforcement. Or maybe technology will identify him first. A relative submitting DNA to a genealogy service. A breakthrough in genetic analysis techniques. An international treaty change that allows broader database cooperation. The evidence is waiting. Science is waiting. And justice, delayed by 25 years and counting, is still waiting. The Miyazawa family deserves answers. Mikio, who was just trying to provide for his family. Yasuko, who was planning New Year's celebrations. Nina and Rei, who were 8 and 6 years old and had their entire lives ahead of them. They deserve better than an evidence room and a memorial stone in a park. So here's the question for you. If you were an investigator on this case today, with all the evidence we've discussed, which theory do you think is most likely? And more importantly, if the killer is identified through genetic genealogy but can't be prosecuted due to jurisdictional or legal barriers, is that justice? Or just knowing without closure? The comments are open, because somewhere out there someone might know something. Someone might have a piece of this puzzle that they don't even realize is significant. 25 years is a long time to carry a secret, but DNA lasts forever, and the truth, eventually, inevitably, finds its way to the surface. The Setagaya case isn't closed. It's just waiting for the right connection, the right breakthrough, the right moment when science and law finally align. Until then, the evidence remembers, and so do we.